Hi, everybody. This is Replenish Earth Live, and I am Tia Kansari, your host. Today, I've got a very special person. I'm very excited to introduce to you Swati Thiyagarajan, who's a conservation journalist and more recently the associate producer of the Netflix series, which is a Netflix documentary, rather. Could be a series, actually. Hey, Swati. And an incredibly successful Netflix documentary, My Octopus Teacher. She was the environment editor at NDTV for a decade or so on her show Born Wild, which is the longest running wildlife and conservation show on a news channel. Understandable why she is two-time winner of the Ramnath Goenka Award for Excellence in Environmental Journalism, the Sanctuary Asia Award, Earth Hero Award, Carl Zeiss Award. Gosh, Swati, what an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. Welcome to Replenish Earth Live.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's great. It's lovely to be on.
Yeah, brilliant. Whereabouts are you calling in from?
Cape Town. So on the shores of False Bay. Yeah, so all the way from Cape Town.
Yeah, right next to the water, right next to, you know, the beautiful wild. And as you were telling me just before we started, the journey into the water continues. You know, the connection with the water is this sort of beautiful connection with the world that you have, the sort of the almost like this unknowable wild, the aspects that we sort of, you know, step into. And I think something that, you know, whether it was watching My Octopus Teacher to, you know, really uncovering for me my own journey of going into the wild, this is a big question that was coming up for me. And I was curious about what is it in your journey that has almost taken you step by step into the wild? Could you talk a little bit about that journey and maybe show us some of the sort of philosophy that you've garnered and also the experiences that you've got from it?
So I was lucky that my dad was always very, very into nature and environment. He went to a Krishnamurti school, Rishi Valley. So, and he's was very, very influenced by J. Krishnamurti. So I've met JK personally, and I've been to a lot of his talks, and then I went to Rishi Valley myself. But my dad's best friend, Siddharth Butch, was an ornithologist, basically started to take me into the wild. I was about five years old when I began going with him. And he was my mentor, and he took me in. And it wasn't just about the natural history and the individual animals and about, the things that you saw, but it was about the ecosystem as a whole. And he made me, from an age of 5, understand that I was very much part of that ecosystem, that I wasn't visiting. And, you know, that this is home. This was my home, not the little house that I lived in, but the actual ecosystem around me was my home. And I had him, and he was wonderful. And for almost 10, 11 years, until he passed away, we spent almost every weekend, going into the Theosophical Society, the forests along the banks of the Adyar River, which used to run down to the Chennai beach. That's where I grew up, and I spent all my time, any free time I had with him, pottering about in the woods, collecting things, looking at animals, studying birds, talking to fishermen who would come back with their day's catches, recording frog choruses in the rain, trying to find slender lorises at night. I had a wonderful, wonderful mentorship from both my dad and his best friend. So that's really how I got into the wild. And I think when you're 5 years old and the two adults that you love and trust so much tell you that nature is your home and that you're part of it, I think because you trust and love them so much, you tend to absolutely believe that becomes your truth and your foundation. And also one of the other things, which I still do, I don't go mostly, it's hard here in Cape Town to find too many trees, but it's something that I learned when I was when I was 5, with Siddharth uncle, when we used to go into the forest, he would always tell me to hug a tree. And he'd say if I pressed my ear against the tree trunk and I was really quiet and I started to feel the tree's energy, And if I just listened hard enough, the tree had stories to tell me, you know.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And, you know, when you're 5, your imagination is active, you're open to these ideas. And so I would hug the tree and I would press my ear up against the tree. And sometimes when it's very quiet and it's just bird song and wind, you can hear the sap running up and down the trunk sometimes, you know, when you press. And especially with the wind in the leaves and the sap, it used to sound like whispers, like little voices. And when you're a child, you have this wonderful world that you create around all of this. And so I love that. I always felt like I had all these secrets I would come back with that the tree told me. And as an adult, I still hug trees everywhere I go if I see a tree, because it maybe brings back that joy and that wonder that I had as a child. Sometimes as adults, you tend to, you know, be more, I guess, logical or cynical maybe about these things, but it brings me a lot of joy and wonder. So yeah, so that's really
That's incredible to hear about. Yeah. The journey, but where it starts, you know, and often it's that trust that is created with the natural world, even if it were the reverence or the respect that you had for the trees or the nature around you, or the cycle that you were watching. Like the fisherman would go out, you'd be, you know, bringing that home, you'd be talking with the fisherman, that, you know, you had an understanding from a very young age of the cycle that nature plays in your life, like the seasonality that it plays in your life. And so there is this, you are within that season, you are within that, you know, using your words, like the umbilical cord of this sort of lifelong connection with the planet. I mean, could you tell us a little bit more about what that umbilical cord is, and also, yeah, like how it's played a role in your life?
So when you, so as I said, because I started going in from when I was very young, and I spent time in the wild with a very, very gifted person in the wild who understood the natural history, who understood so much of the wild, I would say, language in a sense around him, you know, could identify bird calls from alarm calls to just feeding, to just baseline calls, which are just songs birds sing as they go about their day. Just a whole story around what it is this ecosystem doing. So I started doing that very young. So when you start to know, and you feel yourself, and you're barefoot, so you feel the earth. You're touching everything around you. You touch a leaf, you touch the bark of a tree, you see a jackal run by, you see a tree pie, you know, on the tree, the occasional snake, you'll see the fish in the river, you'll see the Brahmini kite swooping in the coast when you walk to the beach. So it was all, this living planet is so alive around you, and you're part of that, what is alive in that living planet. So when we say Mother Nature, it's very, very literal, the mother part of it, because it's not just that we were birthed by nature, but that unlike most birthings where the child leaves the womb and is now an entity in his own right, we still are individuals, but with Mother Nature, the umbilical cord is for life. So you're essentially in a long gestational life. Every bit of air we breathe, every bit of water we drink, all the food that we eat, it comes from the natural world. It's not invented outside of the natural world. And my bones, my blood, my breath, my skin, my hair, I'm a carbon-based life form. The elements that make me are the same elements that make the stars, are the same elements that make the tree, the same elements that make the water and earth and mountain and sky. And it's just we represent in different permutation combinations, you know? So I am of the earth. There's nothing in me that is not of this earth. In fact, a little bit of me is also stardust. So it's of the earth and this universe and that whole living sentient life around us. And yeah, so I think to me that I always try and remember that there's this umbilical cord stretching to the mother, because obviously then I'm more aware that my own actions and behavior could do a feedback loop, which could then turn negative and then, you know, just go awry. Yeah.
I mean, that's fascinating for me because, and I've been sort of meditating on this idea of the umbilical cord since we spoke about it. One of the things that was really coming up was, the umbilical cord is sort of like the food, the growth, the almost like the evolutionary holding of the space that then, in a strange way, sort of becomes nature, right? Like it's sort of like the umbilical cord sort of gets, that's like the bridge between like the mother's placenta that holds the child, um, from the mum to the baby. And I remember this because I actually cut my niece's umbilical cord, and it was like this, it was like this washing machine pipe. I wasn't expecting it to be so thick. I thought it was going to be nice and soft. And actually, it was just like this, like, beast of a pipe, and I was amazed that it was so strong.
Life support system, yeah.
Yeah, like completely, like, sorry to call it a washing machine pipe, but that's basically how thick it was trying to cut it, right? Because I remember my other sister was there, and she just did a runner on the other side. I'm like, well, okay, I'm cutting this.
Yeah.
And my sister Hema, who was having Lily, was sort of like, in this love embrace. It was the most stunning thing I've ever seen in my life. I recorded the entire process. I think it took only 20 minutes. But coming into the birthing process, she just went into the wild. She just said, you know what? I don't think she'll mind me saying this, but like she just went into animal mode. And it was all about being present and being in that sort of like in her body. And I don't know, I'm not a birth or a death doula, but one thing that I naturally gravitated towards was almost like, pressing and holding and massaging her body, especially her back, and like providing like a hand of support onto her back while she was giving birth to Lily. And it was like this beautiful moment when my sister just didn't need, it was like my sister didn't need the nurses around her. She was just like, she literally took her child out. And there was this like incredible moment of seeing when she was looking at her child who wasn't crying, but eyes open, looking at her mother. And it was just like this, like, this is who has been inside me growing. And, being birthed is like that first moment of being seen.
It's really, that's why I call my show Born Wild, because we're all born wild. In that process of birthing, doesn't matter if you're having a water birth or you're having it isolated or you're in a nursing home or the best facility money can buy technologically, that actual process of giving birth, even if it's a cesarean birth, it doesn't matter. That living being that comes out of another living being, when it takes its first breath, when it makes the first cry, when it opens its eyes, for whatever little that it can see at that point, and it's trying to figure out this new world that it's come into outside of that very protected womb, it is a wild animal. It is as wild as a tiger cub being born, a lion cub being born, an elephant baby, shark baby, what have you. It is a wild animal. And life tends to kind of domesticate us down the line as we get older. But we're all born wild. That's who we are in our essence. So that it would be a very raw moment of feeling that wildness in you. And I think for women and I say this all the time, that women, just in the way our bodies function, the very fact that we menstruate every month and it's linked to the moon cycle, and we have that ability to carry life within us, and we have that ability to give birth. And even if you choose not to do it, you have the ability. And if you biologically, for whatever reason, can't because of whatever reason, the point is, it's still that wild system inside you, for whatever reason, not doing what it does. And that's as natural as not, giving birth, in a sense. So, but what I mean is, as women, we are very much more, I think, in touch and in tune with what is raw and what is wild in nature, simply because of how we function with our bodies and how we tend to look at the world around us because of that. And of course, if any of us become mothers, either naturally or we adopt, we know that sense of fierceness and protection and commitment that comes from that. So I think that's very much part of to me, that's, also a large part of understanding. And I think that's why women often have that very deep emotional sensibility when it comes to nature, because I think we're very much more aware of that, of being part of nature in a sense, than I would say men are in a big way. It's a harder, as adults, it's harder for them to occupy that space. And I think for us, you can't but occupy that space because you see how raw your body is. Yeah.
That's exactly it. I mean, coming back to one of the experiences actually that I had with her first child, Hem's first child, Rao, was I remember when she was still pregnant and I'd just come back from Burning Man. I was part of this shamanic tribe, Shaman Dome. And it was, I believe it was my first time. So it was like 2016. And I was just learning about sort of like just the bioelectric energy that's around our bodies. Like one calls it an aura, but it's really just the energy that dissipates into the environment from us. And, I was playing around with a friend of mine who was teaching me about sort of like energetic, energy that passes through the hands. And of course, people are healing with that and or just using the heat for some purposes, Reiki type things. And I mean, from my martial arts training, of course, there is a sort of like the Qigong practice that comes naturally because you're using and creating these beautiful sacred symbols just by virtue of the movements that you're creating. And there was this moment where I'd just come back from, doing a lot of this for an entire week, and it was pretty extreme. And I saw my sister's belly, and she was just like showing us like how big it was. And I was like, do you mind if I put my hands on the belly? And she was like, yeah, go ahead. Kind of reminds me of the moment with you like touching and connecting with the tree. And, it was like that, oh my God, there's something kind of like wild in this, right? Like, and I put my hands on her belly and I was like, whoa, like, of course, Ra was like moving around, and this is sort of like September, October. So this is just like 2 months before he's born. So it's like 7 months. And, in an Indian practice, we normally have this sort of 7 months is when the spirit comes into the actual baby. So we've got the natural practice of a ritual that we do at the time. But there was this moment where with my hands on her belly, these words were coming into me. And I was like, that's interesting. I don't know what these words are. So for some reason, I kind of like reached out to my phone and I typed it out onto YouTube. And I just like, I don't know what it was, but I typed it out and I played it on YouTube. And then my sister just looked at me and she was like, that's the song that I've been playing to my unborn child. And she just looked at me and I looked at her and I looked at the baby and I was like, wow, I didn't know the song. She knew the song.
Incredible.
Like baby knew the song. And I was like this kind of like, I don't know, the words came up and it was just such a fascinating experience. I can never forget that, because for me, it was just like, whoa, there are words that just came up in me. It's almost like you listening to the sap in the actual tree, the whispers of the tree, the whispers of the baby. And it was this sort of like, it's speaking with me. And, and that was like, for me, that was proof. And I think it was about a month ago. And I said, Hem, do you remember that time when? Because I almost felt like a childlike imagination. Maybe I sort of made that up. And she said, no, it was real. Like you definitely did that. And I just thought that there is this sort of sentience in things, in places. And coming back to your, the incredible documentary, there's this moment where Craig actually mentions that you're sort of part of this forest mind, this giant underwater being, brain, as you called it, the mother, the sort of like the knowingness of all of it, being invited into that space, less like the domesticated pet, right, where it's in your home. This is like going to meet the wild. And there's almost like a reference and a fear and an exhilaration that comes out of not knowing what's going to happen, because as you mentioned before to me, that it's the octopus inviting you in. This is not like a carrot that you hold in front of like a rabbit, or some food in front of a cat, and the cat's kind of like purring and like it's dinner time. So like the octopus didn't have that or didn't need that, right? Like it's not as if you're giving the octopus anything, but there was this sort of like there's like you're there and you're present, but like wild sort of coming to you. That must have been such an exquisite experience.
Yeah, that's the deep resonance of any kind of long-term practice of something. So in Craig's case, it was choosing to swim and dive every day in the Great African Sea Forest, and making that commitment and going in every day, regardless of conditions, and whether it was cold, whether it was rainy, whether it was a rough ocean, whether it was a calm ocean, just having made that commitment, and you put yourself there in nature. And there is a certain magic that happens when you make that commitment, because it's almost like these little secret doors start to open up, because you also become more and more and more aware. You're shedding a lot of that domestication, and you're that much more alert when you're in the wild, because you can't help but when you're in nature, you have to be 100% present. You're constantly having to pay attention to the now, this moment, especially when you're in a wild space like the ocean. You have to respect that, the power that ecosystem has. And if you lose attention, your attention wanders, you take it for granted, that's when a big wave, a rock that you don't see, suction under the water, surge, you're going to hurt yourself. So so when you're in the wild, it's like when you're walking in the woods, you pay attention to every moment, because you don't want to step into poison ivy, you don't want to step on a snake, you don't want to startle a predator, you don't just want to trip and fall over a root system and hurt yourself. So you're very, very present. So you're looking it's a very different way of looking. It's a very different way of listening. It's a very different way of moving. It's a very different way of being. You're so alert and so focused and so living in that moment. That is the most alive you are. And therefore, as much, the most in touch with your own wild self in that moment. Because that is what animals really, it's the most mystical, beautiful thing about them, is how much in the moment their entire lives live. Because if an animal in the wild loses attention for a split second, it's either going to lose the prey it's chasing or the predator is going to get it. That's how it functions. So it's we in our lives, because of how convenient we make our own lives, or how routine our lives get. You get up at 8 in the morning, you do this at 9, you do that at 10, you drive here at 11. It becomes so routine. It's almost like practice. So you can do it on autopilot. You can switch off a part of your brain and actually still continue doing stuff in the day. Of course, when it comes to work or when it comes to academics or anything like that, it requires a focus and attention, but it's a different kind of focus and attention. And also in the way that we live our own lives right now, we're always anticipating the next moment. We're projecting into the future. We're making plans for the future. We drag baggage from the past. We're not really paying enough attention to the present, like right this minute, this second, what is going on with me? What is actually happening around me? How much am I living and enjoying this moment? It's always, oops, like that happened there. I got to fix this because that's going to happen next. But in nature, it's this moment. It's this second. What is happening with you right now? What are you seeing right now? What's going on around you right now? That is how you are. So that in itself, when you do it in a constant practice way, as these doors open, that energy changes and these wonderful things start to happen around you. Some of it is fleeting. Some of it is for 5 seconds. Some experiences are 10 seconds. Some experiences last longer in the water. And it's not every day. It's not every week. It's not even every month. But it's just enough to keep you constantly going, oh my God, like you want to do it more, and it draws you in more. And in this particular case, in the Great African Sea Forest, it happened to be this particular octopus who was curious enough to kind of assess him a little bit and then realize that he wasn't a threat. He was just, there. And she realized, okay, he's here every day. He's not hindering my life or her life, I guess, in any way. Because that's the other thing you're very careful of when you're in these spaces. You develop a tremendous respect for the way things work. So you really don't interfere. No matter how wonderful it makes you feel, you have to respect that there is an intelligence and a sentience to that system that was formed millions of years before human beings even arrived on Earth as an idea, before we stepped forward from apes to humanoid to all the way down to modern humans and who we are today, Homo sapiens sapien. But that ecosystem has been around for millions of years. That octopus intelligence has been around for millions of years. The entire system has functioned without you for millions of years. And you don't interfere in that intelligence, because that entire intelligence just functions in its own way. And if you can respect that and you make it a practice and you go in every day and you feel that connection and the living in the now, then this wonderful magic happens. Of course, in this particular case, it was extraordinary that a wild octopus chose to go about her business while Craig was there every day for a large chunk of her life, which is, probably once in a lifetime experience. Maybe will happen to 1 in a million persons who go into these spaces. I don't know. But you do have other extraordinary, wonderful, profound experiences in the wild when you step into it that way and make that commitment. So it is also really, when you find yourself, there are two things that happen. One, you realize you have no control. So you actually feel your anxiety levels and you feel calmer, because that idea of control is what makes you anxious, funnily enough. When you let go of that and you realize you're as wild as anything else in that system and you're just going in there, you actually have to let go. So that's number one. Number two is recognizing that your actual design deep inside who you are, which is the human animal, and realizing that you're as much a part of that ecosystem. It's not an alien ecosystem. We've not come visiting from somewhere else. Sure, if you're not used to the ocean, it's a different ecosystem to be in underwater, because you're used to being on land. Like for me, it took me years to get comfortable in the water, because I nearly drowned as a child and I had tremendous fear of the water, and Craig took years to try to coax me in, and it took me a long time to build my confidence in the water. So of course it feels scary and alien from that perspective, but it's not. It's home, So that very deep realization is a wonderful, extraordinary thing.
I think a lot of us aren't really able to let go of. I mean, it's really interesting. I was having a chat with a friend of mine, Andy, yesterday, and we were talking about conditions, like this sort of like the unconditional love. And she said, but if we do have this sort of like the conditions through which we live, like this whole the idea of unconditional love towards something, despite all of the warts and all of the the beautiful processes, is something quite profound. And it's almost as if that is the kind of relationship that or the responsibility that one steps into the wild with, that it's unconditional love. It's whether you get your arm bitten off or whether you have this beautiful relationship with an octopus. All of it is part of the unconditioned self. And it's really fascinating that you mentioned the sort of like the domestication of our behaviors, domestication of ourselves. In one of my businesses is architectural practice and building. So of course we're in the business of creating environments, right? Like this idea of like the spatial essence that you bring into a physical space, which determines the behaviors of the people that are in that ecosystem. And I think that on the one side we've got this the physical manifestation of whatever we have called civilized or domesticated, right? Like this domestic environment is effectively what creates our behaviors. It shapes not only ourselves, but I think there is room for us to also shape the environment that we're in. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, essentially, of course, as the human, we have our own ways of functioning and our own ways of thinking, doing, very different for different individuals. There's no one way anybody does anything. Of course, a group of people might do something a certain way because they belong to a clan or a community and believe that's the way something should be done. But then another group will believe, it's another way for something to be done. So I think just in the way that we are, we can't help but shape the environment around us. This giant brain that we have, which has shaped our trajectory in this very, very big way, through this thing that we've come to. we've taken, I guess, adaptability on the planet to another level where we now can be either permanently in a cool environment or permanently in a hot environment or permanently in a humid environment, or we can be in an environment just surrounds us with stone, or we can choose to be in an environment that surrounds us with water, or we can choose to be in an environment that has just mountains. So we've taken the idea of adaptation to not I am going to adapt to the natural world, but that I will make the world adapt to my needs. So of course our influence is enormous and huge. And in creating our own little spaces, that says a lot. For some of us, we need a lot of greenery around us. For other people, they like that whole minimalist, kind of very clean setting. They don't like the idea of, I guess, too many potted plants and open spaces and gardens, whether ornamental or otherwise. Some people like wild gardens, people just like wildflowers and all of this to grow. Other people like very neatly manicured lawns, and they like a little ornamental shrub in the corner. And none of it in judgment is bad or good. But it's we can't help ourselves. That is, even indigenous peoples, if you go back down the line, definitely way more in tune with nature and environment than we can claim to be, simply because they live the lives that they live and are therefore very much more aware of just how interconnected our lives and the natural systems are. But even they've engineered the ecosystem around them. And many animals do it. Termites build their termite mounds in the sand, and ants build ant hills, and birds build nests, and, other animals dig burrows. And, every animal actually creates a little environment for itself within the larger environment. The difference being that they use material available in the environment. So automatically everything is biodegradable and natural, and their footprint is very small. It's why we call big animals like elephants, for example, we call them eco-engineers. They're the greatest land eco-engineers on the planet, because when they move, they create natural fire breaks in a forest. As they feed, they can strip a wood down to a point where a forest can become so barren. We think it's barren in our human lifetime, but as they walk away, their dung is leaving all of the seeds and fruits, things from the trees that they've eaten, and a new forest grows where that dung is, and where the old forest was, grasslands come up. And they're ecosystem engineers. Beavers, the way they dam rivers. In the ocean, the way whales, for example, there's a whole trophic cascade with their poo, for example, which feeds into the entire chain of food all the way down. And in a big way now, science is looking at the fact that whale poo has a lot to do with actually fertilizing the phytoplankton in the ocean, which gives us about 70% of the oxygen that we breathe on this planet. So we are breathing oxygen that is thanks to a lot of whale poo that's fertilizing the phytoplankton. So every animal, every living being, eco-engineers around themselves. As humans, we've just taken it to a whole other level. And unfortunately, in a big way, with materials that will not biodegrade, are not environmentally friendly, actually leach into the environment and cause their own problems. Because somewhere we've started thinking with our innovations that we can use technology or our brains or our innovations to do what the natural system actually does. I'm not saying that we can't, with technology, do some of it, but the actual life, the living sentience, the living gifts that the natural system gives us, we still haven't figured out. We can't manufacture air. We can't manufacture water. We can't do anything about food crops and fruits without bees and insects and birds that pollinate and other animals that eat and spread the seeds. And it's the natural system. Today, with the death of bees, for example, in parts of China, they're using humans to individually pollinate by hand crops and flowers because there are not enough bees to do it. And the amount of money it takes and the number of people it takes and the kind of time it takes to do that, what bees do for you for free. No. How do you then say that this is better technology? You just can't. There's no comparison.
I think on the one side, there's this almost, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm saying we have, like, for example, our wireless technology. Today you're sitting in London, I'm sitting here in Cape Town, and we can have this conversation. Amazing, wonderful. Not saying that this technology is bad, but to think that this is now the pinnacle of why we are better or more intelligent than any other being on the planet is problematic. Because you can, like where I live on the shores of False Bay is one of the largest aggregation of humpback whales that come through to feed. But the whales, let's say a few of them come here before the rest of the pod comes. It doesn't matter if the pods are thousands of kilometers away. If the first lot who come realize there's not enough food, they send out a message and the other lot get that message. You can call it telepathic communication. You can call it sound vibrations through water. Call it what you will. The point is they know. They will always know. When trees get overgrazed, when one tree gets overgrazed, it will release a chemical in the leaf called tannin to make the leaf bitter. When that leaf gets bitter, it stops the animals that are overgrazing the tree from overgrazing. That's fine. That's one tree. Every other tree down the line from there will secrete the same chemical to stop the animals from now abandoning this tree and going and overfeeding on them. They're getting the message. In India, in this rainforest, you get big hornbills flying through. And you get these fig trees. That's what these hornbills feed a lot on, are the figs. These trees know, before we do with all of our technology in our meteorological science department, what the monsoon's going to be like or what the weather is going to be like. So some years the same trees, relatively of the same age, will fruit at different times down the line because they know they have to provide the birds that come over those months with food in order for them to get their seeds out to propagate. How do they know? So this kind of discounting of natural sentience and intelligence and sort of proceeding along in our sort of very technocentric superiority kind of idea that we seem to have, it's problematic, and we see what's happening to the world because of it.
But that's the thing about stress. We are creating habitat stress. We're stressing, the external world out. We're stressing the internal world out. I mean, anxiety pills, antidepressants rose, I think, something like a third in the last couple of years in the UK. I don't know what the figure is in the US. It's quite shocking that, here we have an ecosystem that works and functions incredibly beautifully if we can respect it and find in ourselves humility towards it, not try to control it, not try to condition it, not try to make it behave the way that we want it to. To understand it is one thing, and to try and see how that works is one thing. But the moment we start stressing out the habitat, we create this sort of internal feedback of inner stress and more stress. And surely, but there we are trying to create this sort of the methodology to sort of survive, and yet what we've done is we've created, rather than the sort of the inner journey, the Maharishis would probably say in the Himalayas and the regions that they were able to astral travel, spatial dynamic, like in ways that we are trying to understand today. If you look at the studies that were done on the brains of the Tibetan monks whilst they were chanting harmonics, they're already in very interesting inner states, which is what a lot of the work of binaural music or hemisphere synchronization or lucid dreaming or Robert Monroe's work, even for the CIA, had created the sort of pathway and the gateway type projects, which were effectively how to get people to out-of-body experiences. And I feel that much of the science that we have today is almost in a process of trying to understand. And I think that is in itself a very beautiful, humble, almost
Absolutely.
instinct to try and understand something. But where do you think it really does go wrong? Because if by wanting to understand, we're actually getting kicked out of our planet.
Well,
right?
It's
like the bitter, it's like the bitter tannins are basically in our environment right now. And it's like,
Yeah.
you know, human soz. But do you mind?
Yeah. You know, speaking as we started the conversation by talking about when you brought up mental health, and you know, how across the world that's becoming a massive issue, and the amount of medication that's being sort of taken by people to cope with it. And it's a serious issue. And one of the things I believe is that this nature disconnection, that we've sort of engineered our lives to disconnect us in a sense from nature. You know, this kind of not understanding this umbilical cord, or severing that umbilical cord, or putting incredible strain on that umbilical cord, is a huge part of why we're sick in body, mind, and soul. You know, like just take right now the coronavirus, for example. It represents as a disease, and we're all paying the price for this disease becoming a pandemic in all over the world. But it's actually an environment problem. It is when habitats have been lost and animals have been stressed and their immunity systems have crashed, and then they've been captured and placed in captivity and then treated with, you know, worse and further stress on them. And pathogens and viruses that naturally occur. Pathogens and viruses occur naturally in the land, in the water, in the air, in us, in other animals, in trees and plants. They're everywhere. But just because, as I said, there's this incredible biological intelligence that works, you know, everything has a check and balance. You know, it all works beautifully in this check and balance. And occasionally this intelligence will release one thing simply because it needs to bring something else into balance, life and death in a cycle that works. As humans, of course, for us, that, you know, in the way we function, in the way we love family, in the way we love community, in the way we love each other, it's, you know, we can't just be blasé about the life and death cycle. It's a very serious, severe, traumatic thing for us, you know, loved ones, friends, family, what have you. So I'm not saying that our sort of all the technology and all the studying and all the science, it's propelling us towards perhaps somewhere this idea of either immortality or living longer or saving lives, which is all good. Not immortality and living longer, but the saving of lives. It's an, you know, it's a wonderful, noble path to be on. But when you're taking that path and it's all about saving lives, while the very thing that is your life, which is your natural system, is collapsing under the strain and the weight and the kind of disconnect that you have with it, it's counterproductive to everything that we're doing. And that's what we're seeing with the coronavirus. It's probably, you know, it's probably a virus in a bat that probably transferred into either a pangolin or another animal. And these animals were consumed in unhygienic ways in some wet market, did a big jump, spillover event, as we call it, into the humans. And now here we are. And this is really just the beginning, because if you really look at the way biodiversity is being lost across the planet, the way habitats are vanishing across the planet, there's just going to be more of this happening. And when biodiversity and habitats get lost across the planet, as humans, we are coming into contact with animals and with plants and with situations that we normally would have had a huge array of things between us and them, which were taking all the hits and which were keeping things in balance and which were keeping things right. And you're now compressing and compressing and compressing that. And there's just the pathogen and then there's you. So that's the problem. And so that's really where our thing is, where our seeking knowledge and our need for knowledge and our need to understand and our need to do all of that is wonderful. But if it constantly happens without a basic understanding of the fact that everything that we do, every edifice that we build, every invention that we create, everything that we do stands on the foundation of the natural world. It's kind of like, you know, building a high rise, which is probably wonderful, but having like at the same time digging a hole in your foundation, you know, the building's not going to stand for too long. That's where we are. And I think the other problem is that in our natural design, who we are is the human animal. We are phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, kingdom Animalia. You know, we are genus, you know, apes, Homo sapien. That's who we are. And all of this domestication, as I call it, which is taking us further and further and further away from those roots, from that deep connection, from that understanding of that deep connection, is a huge schism in the human mind, because there's in your DNA and your blood, you recognize that need for nature. For the majority of the time that we've spent on Earth, and I'm just now going to talk about being modern humans, Homo sapiens sapien, let's say about 200,000 years. For the majority of that time, up until about 10,000 years ago when we started agriculture, we lived as hunter-gatherers. We lived as wild as any animal on the planet. That is, so if it's 200,000 years, and for 85% of that time, that was our design. In such a short time, look at everything we've done to ourselves and how much we've distanced ourselves from that design. No system can cope. And so anxiety, stress, depression, violence, anger, seeing each other as different, very quickly defaulting to this is my community and you're different and your belief and my, all of this crap, because we don't see that we're one with this living planet and that there's no separation. So that's really where we're at.
I think that's, I mean, I'm going to go back and listen to you probably over and over and over again, because on the one side, I have inside me this desire to be with nature, and I get really annoyed with, as you called it, the sort of ornamental ecosystems like parks. And I think I've mentioned it in a previous talk where it's like, don't worry about it. Wild is this piece of lawn, rectangular, with a few trees dotted across, and that's what we're going to call a park inside a city. And that's your relationship with nature. For anybody who's brought up in these like really large cities like Birmingham, London, New York, wherever, it's like there's sort of the connection with nature doesn't really exist, because what we've done is sort of like separated ourselves from nature. And as it comes to the sort of like the narrative of separation, the more and more and more and more we think that we're superior, we get to separate our own prejudice and our own privilege, even, to
totally. I think that's one very important thing to mention is the privilege. Obviously it's easier for me to have these experiences and to think about these things deeply and to feel these connections and to live this life, because I've been lucky enough from my childhood to have a certain kind of life that allowed me access, right? So there is 100% privilege involved. One cannot step away from that and be all like, oh, well, I discovered this thing and I'm so wonderful. Nonsense. I've had the access and I have the privilege to do that. Having said that, then you move into a space where you don't have that relationship at all. Then it becomes very easy, as I said, to also then discriminate against each other. If you don't feel that oneness the whole time. There's a story that I read years ago, which always resonated with me. This, I think, had to do in Germany, somewhere in the Black Forest. And they discovered, I think, tin deposits in one of the areas of the Black Forest. And they were there was a bid for tin mining in the area. And for some of the local communities that lived in and around that area, they really wanted it to happen because it would have meant an economic boon and jobs and, all of that, which is so, you can't take away from that being important to a lot of people. A group of scientists studying wildlife in that area didn't want the tin mine to come up because it was one of the stretches of the Black Forest at the time that had wolves. And so they said that for tin mining, it involves strip mining, which means literally there'd be nothing left of the ecosystem. It's not a discrete way of going into the earth and extracting tin. It's strip mining, stripping basically like all the trees, all the grass, all the earth, like just literally leaving a wasteland, And they said the wolves wouldn't survive that. And the pushback against the scientists said, are human lives more important or are the lives of wolves? And one of the scientists said, all lives are important in ideology. Of course, all lives are important and equally important. But he said, if we today decide that the lives of these wolves here is not important, tomorrow someone else will decide, a group of humans, their lives here is not important. Because there will always be
where
something. in the hierarchy that's more important in the human hierarchy. And I always say that those of us, again, who have the privilege to think about these things and make choices and to look around us and to wake up a little bit, we have to do it because we've been blessed enough and given the privilege to be able to do it. There are millions of people across this planet who are literally scrabbling for a livelihood, just trying to feed their children, just get food on the table. The stresses are unimaginable. And the great moral dilemma of our times is the people who are suffering the most leave the least footprint on the planet. And those of us who have these privileged lives leave the biggest footprint on the planet, but the price is being paid again by those that actually don't consume as much and don't cause nearly as much damage as we do. So it's a lifestyle and livelihood issue. So livelihood is literally survival. It's how do I put food on the table today? So what do I need to do that for today? To feed my child, feed myself, how do I do this? The interesting thing is livelihood issues, if someone is sensitive enough or a government will pay attention or an NGO, what have you, can pay attention, you can come up with solutions for livelihood issues. The biggest problem is lifestyle issues. That's people like you and me. The shoes, the bags, the clothes, the travel, the constant consumer cycle that we're in. Lifestyle. The only way to change lifestyle issues is literally for you and me to wake up and make different choices. And that's a far trickier beast. And yet we constantly expect the people who are scrabbling for a livelihood to be doing better when we're not. So I'm always, or at least I try always to be aware that when I talk about the environment or I talk about being more aware of the natural system around us or to save the environment or anything to do with wildlife and conservation, I really try constantly to stay aware of the fact that I am speaking from a place of privilege. Even if we are women of color, we're still in a place of privilege compared to a lot of women who are scrabbling for livelihood, across the world. So, yeah.
Mm. There's this sort of almost like to help us sort of wrap up. One part of me awakens to this relationship that is so much in my heart, but heart as being so reverent. I feel reverence for that which I don't know, and I am humbled for the knowledge and the like your documentary, sort of, to be aware of how we can connect with, this greater brain, this greater being, right? Whether we call it the divine, the creator, the slew of there's so many different kinds of ways of mapping and understanding that relationship. Next steps, where are we? Where can we go? Of course, there is the create a greater understanding and strengthen that the energetic umbilical cord that we have with Mother Nature. There is the stepping into the self, just as much as we've almost externalized all of our security, right? By whether it is, like Ada said in a previous recording, we've kind of created that security bit in things, and we've kept them in our homes and accumulated them, or we've created that sort of security in the ideas, right? We gathered these ideas and philosophies and books and suggestions, and this what we are is sort of like the territory that we've created, the ecosystem that we want to behave in, this habitat that we want to create, but it's largely without the other. It's largely without a concern for the other as well. So how can our awakening, right, be met with the tools that are present in nature for us to sort of learn from, like the scientists in the Black Forest who said, well, one day we're going to use that hierarchy against ourselves, and I believe that happens, and I know that
it's happened through human history. Look what we've done with Indigenous peoples around the world. That's just fact.
And yet we're all indigenous to Earth. We're all
Yeah,
somewhat
absolutely. Yeah,
always go back to the journey of the wild, right? Like we've all spawned from the same sort of spot.
absolutely.
So
yeah,
we spawned from that. We've created all sorts of lifestyle infrastructure and mentalities around, you know, who we are and what we're doing. I suppose what I'm asking is, what now? You know, like we've created so much stress on the environment. We recognize that. We're seeing that. Look at Californian fires. Look at, you know, California's brought in the 2035. Sorry, if you've got like a fossil fuel car, you're out. You know, can't use that here. So we will see the sort of like eco legislations stepping in and stepping up to the challenge, not the sort of, hey, look, we're gonna sign this sort of like the Paris Agreement, we're gonna sign the Kyoto Protocol. Okay, now what? Like you've signed it, but the implementation of it is an entirely different ballgame. So how can we implement, right? How can we police? How can we build into the infrastructure? There's one thing to be accountable to the self, but it's an entirely different thing to be accountable to the whole.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. I mean, science is incredibly important in letting us understand how things work. And that's a very important thing to know. So one can't discount the role of science from that perspective. But unfortunately, what a lot of science has done is actually cut us off further from that very raw instinctive understanding of how things are. So in the detail of constantly trying to figure out how it works, we've forgotten what it is in the first place. And I think, honest to God, doing this work for over 20 years now as a conservationist, it's come a full cycle, starting out by telling people constantly that things are collapsing and you need to save it because to save yourself, or you need to save it because otherwise it's doomsday, or, oh my God, everything is collapsing. And that's why it will cause maybe momentary reaction. We'll come up with momentary solutions. We may even live it for a couple of months and then we'll go straight back, because our human brains aren't designed to constantly live on that edge of survival and flee and flight, and you know, that constant, it's exhausting. And also it's how should I put it? It takes away all hope. And if hope goes away, then what is left? Why would we bother? Why would we fight? Why would we want to do anything? So I think the going forward is finding love. And I know it sounds like a simple thing to say, but what I mean by that is refinding within yourself that belonging, that understanding that you are wild and raw and you are nature. And then you start connecting again, even if it's with a little bit of greenery around you. Just the very fact that you're breathing, you're connecting. When you step out into the rain, that rain is not new. It's that water was formed millions of years ago, and it, you know, became water vapor, and it filled our lakes, rivers, streams, and oceans. It's the same water that evaporates and comes down as rain. The same water droplets that roll down the back of a dinosaur is the same rain that's falling on your face and my face. You know, it's that connected. And to me, the way I would like to see it is, I would like to, rather than be all afraid and fight against something, I rather fight for a world I want to see. And opening yourself up a little bit to nature brings in empathy. And when you bring in empathy, you bring in love. And when you have both empathy and love, which I think are the two most profound things a human can cultivate, then you don't see separation. And when you don't see separation and you just feel that love and empathy, then you want everyone around you to be happy, not just the few chosen people in your head, everyone. Because again, if anything, the coronavirus has taught us is that we're only as strong as the weakest sections of our society. That is how interconnected we are. Something that happens today in one corner of the world, it's a round planet. It is, and there's an immediate effect in another corner of the world. We're all so incredibly connected. And I think really a different philosophy where we move away from this, you know, very point A, point B, point C leading to point D, so therefore do this, and this very empirical way of functioning, to really move towards a heart space of functioning where you really look at it and you go, this is my children's world. This is their children's world. And this beautiful world has sustained my life, and it needs to sustain more life. And my actions are impacting so many people around me. Just empathy, compassion, love. I think if we don't, and the funny thing is, when we find that within ourselves, the amount of that comes back to us, which can then heal all of the other stuff that you're going through, feeling lonely, feeling not connected,
disconnected,
anxiety, whatever. It's ultimately goes down to the root of something that happened that made you feel not connected, not appreciated, not paid attention to, made to feel worthless, whatever it is. That's really it. It's that the core of it is right there. So that's as Sea Change Project, the organization I belong to, that is our tagline: remember you are wild. And our focus is trying through our stories and our experiences to get other people excited about finding their little connections and their little experiences wherever you are, and hopefully finding that joy. That's how at least I see, or I hope to see it go. And hopefully if more of us can see that, then we will be living in a different world down the line. We don't have to stress and suffer so much. So yeah, that's how I see it.
Thank you, Swati. I have a vision that one day I will see that day where Earth has been replenished. One day I will see that, and I hold that very dearly inside me, and for me it's real. So I will work every single day. I will do my absolute best. No pressure, but yeah, it's been an absolute
pleasure. It's not a bad goal to have.
I think it's a brilliant one, actually. The
exactly.
definite chief aim, that Bruce Lee.
And I love the name of the Replenish. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. That's what we are all talking about now: is regeneration, rewilding, regrowing, recreating. So replenishing, very, very important.
Totally. But the replenishing is not just the external aspect, it's the internal replenishing. How the hell are you going to go out there and replenish the world if you haven't replenished yourself? So this is a personal journey just as much as it is an external journey. That relationship of the bridge between one side of the umbilical cord and the other must exist, and that bridge is the replenishing bit, that which already is in the DNA of the stem cells, right? Those cells that have already inside them the ability to turn into absolutely anything. And that's where at the core is, your imagination, like you as a 5-year-old, like learning about these stories, recognizing that in you was that DNA as you grow older. For me, it was, David Attenborough's voice. Because of course, like living in Birmingham, surrounded by houses, wasn't exactly my opportunity to go out into the woods and to see all of this wild. But his stories were, and his stories and his relationship with Africa, which was so beautiful for my father, who left Africa at a very young age to come to the UK. For him, it was that sort of like the savannah, the wild, the wow, that is actually really there. That's what I come from. That's what I am part of. So that became the umbilical cord for him, and for us, of course, to have heard the stories and the voice of almost like the voices of those that become the whispers, that become the energetic connection that we end up having. And I suppose that they're there for all of us. They're there for all of us to explore and to understand. I mean, some people may medicate those voices out, but I really hope that people can hear the words of Swati, and to appreciate in us is that sentience. We are part of that sentience, and if that sentience is something that you're curious about, please go out there and inquire about it, just like Craig did with the octopus. So on that note, please go and watch My Octopus Teacher if you haven't already. Please go and explore the Sea Change Project if you haven't already. And very much looking forward to following your journey, Swati. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's been lovely.